Now this is a talk about regional and social differences in English. Very superficial, very cursory, because we haven't got more than 3/4 of an hour. But first of all, just to remind you that languages are full of variety, English in particular, being spoken by large numbers of people, varies a great deal. For example, in the north of England, someone might well say, "Yon is a gradely lass." And you might not understand those words because they're local. Gradely in the north of England means attractive, pleasant, good. Lass means girl, so she's a nice girl. Or in the north of England you might get, "I was sat in corner." I was sat in corner, which means I was sitting in the corner. Grammatical difference there, word for was, sat for sitting, in corner for in the corner, and so on. Now, native speakers of English are exposed to this sort of thing all the time and get used to it. Differences not only in vocabulary, but also in syntax and morphology, that is in grammar. We've got an example of that for the I were in the north. In the south, including in London, you get you was, which is the non-standard choice between was and were. What was you doing, rather than what were you doing. And I ain't done nothing, or I haven't done nothing, which is negative concord, in place of the standard I haven't done anything, I haven't done a thing, I've done nothing, where we have just a single negative. So that sort of thing is familiar to everybody. Today the emphasis, though, is on differences in pronunciation. And the first matter we will look at, there are some more northern words, some meaning something, out and out meaning anything and nothing. We look at some of the widespread but non-standard pronunciation characteristics in most parts of England. And the first of these is H dropping. In popular speech, in most parts of England, people tend to omit H some of the time or all of the time. So here in London pronunciation is a picture of an hammer, which you will know better as a hammer. And you can see that it's got an head and an handle, better known as a head and a handle. There is a healthy heart, popularly an healthy heart. Healthy heart. I've transcribed the Cockney pronunciation of those words, and you can see how they are different from the standard healthy heart. We have a gardener who cuts the lawn for me regularly, and he's a Londoner, and he's aware of this because in my garden there is a hedge down one side, and he says, "I'll cut the lawn right up to the edge." And he's aware that that's ambiguous as between the edge and the hedge, and he makes a joke out of it. Another very widespread phenomenon is popularly known as G dropping. This concerns the ending spelt ing in verbs and so on, where we have what I call an H, a high version, and an L, a low version. The standard, educated, quote, correct form is with a velar nasal, talking. The popular, the low form, is with an alveolar nasal, talking. So the difference is talking, standard, talking, non-standard. Now, if your language is Spanish or Japanese, you might find it quite difficult to hear that difference. But English ears are attuned to it. We don't explicitly say to ourselves, "Ha, he's using an alveolar instead of a velar nasal." What we say is, I see the social class that person comes from. And we categorize him as being vulgar or as being posh. And depending on our own position, we might resent either one or the other. But This is one of the things we tune into as we listen to other native speakers in order to slot them into categories. When we meet a stranger or when we just listen to someone talking, we think, where does he come from? Where does she come from? And we think, what kind of social background does this person come from? And inevitably we make these judgments all the time, and this is the sort of evidence that we use. This doesn't tell us about regionality because all kinds of English virtually have this alternation. What it does tell us about is the person's level of formality, formal versus casual, or the level of education, or whatever. Many, many speakers sometimes use one, sometimes use the other, and switch between them. Others, more or less consistent, and stay just with one. This is often shown in writing by putting IN apostrophe instead of ING. Of course, it's not really leaving out a g sound, it's using an alveolar rather than a velar nasal. But that's how it's shown in spelling. So here we've got the standard running and the non-standard run-in. It also applies in words other than verbs, words like evening, that end in the same way, evening, and feeding, there's another verb, giving you feeding. I've added that one because when we have a T or a D before the ing, you can get a syllabic consonant. So instead of feeding or feed-in, you can have just feeding, feeding. Putting something down, for putting something down, sitting in a chair rather than sitting in a chair. These are enormously common in popular English, but most learners of English as a foreign language are not explicitly exposed to them. And I think you ought to be. I think you ought to know about this because it is so widespread. I wouldn't do it myself, but millions and millions of people do it. The thing ending in something, anything, nothing is a little different because this has special variants, vary a good deal from place to place. In London, instead of something, you often hear a k at the end giving something. Something happened. Have you got anything to do? There was nothing there. But because it's London, we get further reductions. You can get something, or indeed something with an F in it. In the north of England, you get summat, anything, anything, and in the north of England, out. So those are very variable words. We'll start off by considering the north of England, because probably among accents of England, a northern accent is the easiest for you as outsiders to immediately recognise. And generally speaking, we can say that the north of England has resisted certain innovations that took place in the south and in the standard. So, to that extent, Northern English is conservative. It retains an earlier state of the language. One of the examples of this conservatism is the retention of a g, a velar plosive, where it's represented in the spelling at the end of a word such as sing. Standard pronunciation just has a velar nasal. Sing. Northern pronunciation, northwestern pronunciation keeps g, thus sing. To sing a song. To sing a song, rather than to sing a song. And someone who does this is singing in the formal pronunciation, probably singing in the less formal one. Again, with a gut there. Someone who performs is a singer rather than the standard singer. So one easy test you can ask is, does singer, someone who sings, rhyme with finger or not? In Liverpool, in Birmingham, yes, singer, finger, rhyme. In London, in most parts of the world, no, they don't rhyme. Singer, finger, singer, finger. This is an interesting variable because it's relatively below the level of consciousness. This is not something people get all terribly worried about and denounce as being wrong. It's just a regionally different thing which very largely passes unnoticed. And people from that area, when I get students, you know, from Manchester somewhere, they're often quite surprised to be told about it because they'd never thought about this. But there we are. A much better and much higher profile northernism concerns the vowel in words such as strut, words that have this R vowel in RP and most other kinds of English. And again, we can look at this quite helpfully by considering rhymes. If we take the word put it down, and compare that with the verb cut it in half, do these words rhyme or not? In most kinds of English, they don't rhyme. Put, cut, cut. But in Northern English, popular Northern English, they do rhyme. The precise quality may vary, so you can get put and cut, or you can get a more elegant put and cut. But the point is, it's the same sound in both categories of word. So we have people in the north of England who will address you as love, or love, which in the south would be love. In the south they don't call you love anyhow, but you stand waiting for a bus and you get on a bus, which in London would be a bus. So it's an easy thing to pick out. What does a northerner say? Not thank you very much, but thank you very much. When I was sort of very new at all of this, I used to have to drive to see my parents in the north of England. I was living in London, they were living in the north. And one day I stopped at a place called Peterborough, which is sort of not far from Cambridge. Cambridge is in the south of England. So I was very interested on the streets of Peterborough to hear people saying thank you very much and calling people love. Because that shows me that Peterborough lies to the north of this line across England. There is a map. This is from Bev Collins's book, and you can see that shaded area is where we find U or A in strut words, pronounced then as strut. Peterborough is about there, so just beyond the boundary. And I was therefore very interested, and I was very young doing this, to observe that it was north of the line, and that helped me fix where the line is. Okay, we've got another example here, which is full and dull, which again rhyme in the north of England as full and dull. And there is a place on the east coast, a port called Hull, which of course locally then is Hull, or with H dropping, Hull. So if you hear somebody saying, I come from Hull, you've got to be able to interpret that as Hull, H-U-L-L. The phrase good luck is interesting because in most kinds of English there are different vowels in the two words. Good has U, luck has A. But now think, if you grow up in the north of England, you probably use the same vowel in both words, and you say something ranging from good look to good luck. And the problem for northerners who are, as we say, upwardly mobile, that is trying to conceal their lower class origins, which means adopting something closer to received pronunciation, have problems with this kind of phrase. Because, okay, they know that look is northern and has to be changed to luck. But by the same token, if you've got good, they feel as if they ought to change it to gud. So you get gud luck, which is posh northern, and southerners laugh at it because they've got it wrong. Or of course, Northerners can even get more confused and say, "God, look," and get them the wrong way round. Very tricky. This is always a problem if you try to go from a smaller system to a bigger system, whether we're talking within the same language or in a language learning, foreign language learning context. If your target variety makes more contrasts than you do in your native variety, there are going to be difficulties. This is why the difference between ban and bun is difficult for Japanese learners, because you don't have a corresponding contrast in your language, and it's why good luck is tricky for Northerners trying to talk Southern. So, stepping back a little and thinking about the abstract organization of the vowels, here are the short vowels in English, the short stressable vowels, short strong vowels. And in a typical Southern system, received pronunciation and most other varieties in the world in general, we've got 6 possible short vowels, as in the sets kit, dress, trap, lot, strut, foot. And the point I'm making here about popular Northern English, English, is that there are only 5. So you've got kit, dress, trap, lot, foot, and strut. Now, it's, I think, helpful to make a distinction between cases where you just have a difference of quality. Okay, Northerners tend to say dress with a rather opener vowel than Southerners who say dress. Dress, 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 dress. But it doesn't matter. We can map them straight from one to the other. The point is where you have more or fewer contrasts being made, and where the Southerners have the difference between up and strut, foot, strut, foot, strut, foot, but the Northerners only have a single thing, strut, foot, strut, foot, strut, foot. The next Northernism I want to consider, really perhaps we should think of it as being a Southernism, having a long vowel in words like bath, because most varieties of English in the world use the same vowel of trap and say bath. Received pronunciation, and the south of England in general has undergone a lengthening of a before voiceless fricatives, so that rather than the historical bath, we say bath. This is an innovation in the south of England, resisted in the north, resisted in American English, resisted in various other kinds of English. And this applies then to a whole number of words where we have a voiceless fricative. S as in pass, glass, grass, staff. F labidental as in raft, laugh. TH dental fricative as in bath, path, and some disyllabic words after castle and so on. And so all of these in the north of England have their short ap vowel, the same as in trap, which again is not quite the same in quality, but anyhow, Northerners then have pass, glass, grass, staff, raft, laugh, bath, path, after, castle. Northerners have different feelings depending on whether we're talking about cut and put on the one hand or bath and bath on the other hand. Because whereas Northerners can be convinced that they ought to posh up, southernize their accent and say cut something in half rather than cut it in half, they're very resistant to changing bath to bath. Bath is seen as a strange southernism which they don't wish to be associated with. This doesn't cover all Northerners, because I'm a Northerner myself, but I was brainwashed by going to boarding school in the south of England where we had a bath once a week, I'm sorry to say, in those days. But anyhow, that's what we called it, and so that's what I'm saying. What is complicating or interesting here is that some words resisted this sound change, or were borrowed into the language after it had taken place. And so, although we have bath in Southern English, in RP and so on, we say maths for mathematics, different vowel. We say castle, but we say tassel. We say to pass along, but gas. Whereas in the north of England, these have the same vowel, they rhyme. So math and maths, castle, tassel, pass and gas. You can see again that northerners might get, if they try to change this, might get it wrong. And so a northern caricature of someone pretending, someone trying unsuccessfully to be posh, is to say turn on the gas rather than turn on the gas. It's gas everywhere, but it feels to a northerner as if there ought to be a southern pronunciation gas. There's a suburb of Liverpool called Blundell Sands, which of course locally is Blundell Sands. And if you want to poke fun at someone who has, in your view, become too wealthy and pretending to be upper class, you might say they live in Blundell Sands. I've even heard Fulham in London referred to as Flan. Again, as a joke, as a joke. So this kind of thing provides us lots of opportunity, not only for categorizing people, but also for playing with the language. This, as you will know, is a sound change that the Americans didn't adopt. So in American English, cat, glass, grass, staff, and so on have their cat vowel, their tramp vowel. There's a map of it. That's showing the southern area shaded where we get R in Bath words. Again, this is from Collins and Base. Now, people who don't come from the north of England often, or indeed those who do, often get somewhat confused about this because it can seem to southerners as if what northerners have is one fewer vowel. Because they say bath rather than they expected bath, southerners sometimes think that's because they've only got one R vowel, they're not making the R contrast. And this is helped by the fact that the quality in Northern English can often be very similar in the two words. So you get trap, bath, start, rather than start. So southern trap, bath, start, to exaggerate the difference. Northern trap, bath, start, to minimize the difference in quality. And so you see that northerners do have a contrast of length, but it's not as strongly supported by a qualitative difference as in the south of England. So if we take a pair of words like ham and harm, that's meat, ham, damage, harm, they are different in all kinds of native English. But in the north they're going to be ham and harm, much the same quality, difference in length. In the south, ham and harm. In the west, of course, and in American English, ham and harm with or without an R in it. When I was researching the pronunciation dictionary, I carried out various surveys in which I asked people to vote for their preference between two or more pronunciations. And one of the words I asked about was chance, and another one was the number 1. These are of interest because they are different in the north and the south of England. But the problem is, of course, that not all northerners use the northern pronunciation because they're aware that the standard form, the approved form, the form you find in dictionaries, is the southern form, chance. So you've got northern chance, northern popular chance, southern and standard chance. And there you can see a graph, or perhaps a graph, of people's voting for A and R. R is at the top, A is at the bottom, but showing it here along with people's age group. And what you can see here is that for the oldest age group on the left, there was much more likelihood of people voting for chance than for the younger age groups on the right. And yet, the proportion of northerners to southerners was more or less the same throughout my sample. So what this tells us is that northerners, when answering a questionnaire about pronunciation, if they were older people, were more likely to defer to the perceived standard and say they preferred the standard form, the southern form, chance, even if it wasn't really their own everyday pronunciation, chance. Whereas the younger people were less likely to give way to southernisms in this respect and more likely to insist on their own local chance pronunciation. And I interpret this as a decrease in the deference that people show towards received pronunciation. We see the same thing in the case of the number 1. Now, here, by no means all northerners say 1 anyhow, but some do. 1 is a pronunciation found only in the north of England, whereas 1, or the equivalent northern 1, is found in other places. And again, although the ratio of northerners to southerners is the same in my sample, you can see the same trend that older people are more likely to say they prefer 1, younger people less likely to say that and to admit to preferring their own 1. All right, so a quick run through some more phonetic differences. When I was doing my imitation northern earlier on, I was using, I said a gradely last, didn't I? Gradely, that's gradely. In the north of England and in various other places, you can get monophthong instead of the diphthong A. So for the word face, instead of fa, you can get the monophthong A, face, face. What's your name? Name. This is a table, a table, a table. An older pronunciation before the diphthong came in. From one day to another, day for day. The same with the back vowel, rather than the diphthongal O or O, goat, we can get a monophthong goat, 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 goat. The actual quality of this monophthong varies a good deal too. There are places where they say something like good, and something like boot, or something like goat, you can get that. Where I grew up in Lancashire, it was a fairly open O. I don't know, for I don't know. And my brother's name is Tony, and so he was known locally as Tony. Hello, Tony. I'm Tony. Now, some people, in rather small areas, retain a contrast between what was historically a monophthong and what was historically a diphthong. So the pair toes, which in most kinds of English are homophones, pronounced identically, the toe on your foot, to toe something, to pull it along, a toe truck there. In some people's speech will be different with toe and toe. Similarly, the number 8 historically had a diphthong, whereas late didn't. And some people retain this difference, 8, late, 8, late, 8 with a diphthong, late with a monophthong. But that's disappearing fast as people adopt the diphthong everywhere and move from saying late to saying late. You also get this contrast in certain parts of South Wales, which is actually where I first came across this. In my very first year teaching at UCL, I was doing beginners phonetic transcription with a class of native English speakers, and among them was somebody from South Wales who complained that the list of symbols that I'd supplied them with wasn't adequate to represent his own speech because I didn't give him 2 separate symbols to show the difference between 8 and late, and they're different. 8, and late, that's the same. So I learned something from my pupils, And this is a very valuable thing that every teacher discovers, that you learn from your pupils as well as teaching them. And so I was alerted to this contrast and found that there's a whole area, Swansea Valley, where people often retain this contrast, historical contrast, which has otherwise disappeared from English. All right, on to the regions of England. In the west of England, people still may retain the R, which is shown in the spelling, when it occurs before a consonant or finally in a word. So the word farmer illustrates this very nicely, because we've got before the M, farmer, and then at the end, giving the West of England pronunciation farmer, 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 as against the more general farmer, farmer, and non-roti pronunciation. You're familiar with this, again, of course, from American English, because in most kinds of American English, the historical R is retained in all positions. Now, having very quickly moved through those things, I want to consider the southeast of England, London, because it seems to me that for at least the last 500 years, or probably longer, London has been the main source of new trends, things that originate in London then spread out elsewhere. And so let's look at some contemporary ongoing changes in London. One very well-known one is what we call TH fronting, whereby the dental fricatives are replaced by labiodentals. So instead of thing, we can get fin, something. Instead of mouth, we can get mouth, mouth. Instead of mother, the corresponding voiced one, we get mother. For father, we get father. There's a song by a Cockney couple called Chas and Dave, in which they say, I can tell you I would rather be on the Costa Brava, rhyming Costa Brava, Costa Brava with father, rather. And this means that when we count, we go 1, 2, 3. And indeed here we have 33 for 33. This sound change seems to be spreading very fast. It's found almost everywhere now in England. Depending on the age of the speaker, you often find that older people don't do it, but younger people have started to do so, and it's now being reported from Scotland and even from Ireland, so spreading fast. Another thing that's spreading out is L vocalization. You know about clear L and dark L. Clear L before a vowel, let, flow, allow. Dark L before a consonant, or finally, milk. Well, it's the dark L that has undergone a change, which means that it's lost its alveolar articulation, leaving behind just a back vowel, general O area. So instead of milk, we get milk, 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 milk. And instead of being contained in bottles, in London, it can be in bottles. Bottles, bottles. That's a glottal stop, that's a further thing we should come to. But you notice the syllabic L replaced by O. More examples, shell, seashell, bowl, light bowl, a pencil, which you write with, and the Great Wall of China. Wall. Okay, wherever you could get a dark L, you have this new trend to vocalize it. It can be found even in received pronunciation in certain positions, particularly adjacent to labials. Gibson, my predecessor, pointed this out 50 years ago, that in words like myself, you can get vocalization and it passes unnoticed. If you say myself, self, rather than myself. There are certain words already where already has really become perhaps the predominant form, and the L is vocalized or indeed lost. So this is an ongoing trend. It's good news, I think, for learners of English as a foreign language, because if you find dark L very difficult to produce, then it's better to do this than to either produce a clear L. If you say milk with a clear L, milk, well, it could be sort of Irish or something, but it's likely to be, it can be difficult to understand. I remember I had one Irish friend who was talking about milk, and I thought he was talking about meat, because I didn't hear the typical all of the dark L in it. And of course, if you're Japanese, it's better to say milk than to say milk, because milk is not easy for English people, English speakers, native speakers, to understand as meaning milk. All right, glottal stops then. This is a very old slide, as you can see by the kind of printer that we had 20 years ago. I ought to replace it with a more modern picture, I think. That's Arabic. Glottal articulation replacing alveolar articulation for T in various positions at the end of words, generally speaking at the end of a syllable before a consonant, for example, and also in these words like butterfly, kettle for butterfly, and kettle. You probably know that in standard accents of English, glottal stop for T, at least in casual speech, is very general, before another consonant, or at the end of a word before a consonant in the next word. What happens in London, and it is spreading out, is glottal stops even between vowels for T. Traditional Cockney also has what we call a diphthong shift. You get this in Australian English as well, where the diphthong A, face, moves one stage further to I, face. That's more face, isn't it? Face, 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 and indeed can even, in some kind of Cockney, get to face, face, face. Doesn't fall in with price, though it might sound a bit like it. Price, it in turn shifts to price, price, or indeed price. Price. What's a price? But face and price are distinct, even though they might sound confusingly similar. Standard face and price. Latest research in London shows that this Cockneyism is being reversed in the inner city. Although you'll find it in the outer suburbs, where people who used to live in the inner city have moved to 40 years later, the new people who come to live in the inner city, influenced by recent immigration, have undone this change and gone back to saying face and price, which hasn't stopped it continuing to spread out in waves through the country. Now, I want to finish by looking at one or two recent trends that I discovered in, I confirmed in my surveys that I conducted. I used to say that saying tune rather than tune was most frightfully vulgar and not appropriate for received pronunciation. I was, wrong, in as much as it's changed its status. And in my survey, a lot of people voted for tune with an African ch rather than tune. And similarly, you get tutor and Tuesday and student. Work carried out by a Norwegian researcher into the pronunciation used by television newsreaders, Dr. Hannisdal, shows that, they too are now very generally saying on Tuesday rather than on Tuesday. So for somebody old-fashioned like me, this is not a nice pronunciation, but clearly I'm out of touch with modern trends. Same thing with the voiced one. Duty, giving way to duty. Reduce, giving way to reduce, making it like orange juice. And endure, giving way to endure, enduring to juring. So this too is becoming more accepted, more widely accepted. Something that is still not all that widely accepted is what I call NT reduction. It's very difficult to characterize exactly who does this and when, but if you take the number 20, you will often hear people saying 20, 23. Okay, it's American, that's another issue. But in Britain, it's really rather widespread as a kind of casual pronunciation. The big difference between British and American English here is that in American English, it can affect any word that has NT in the appropriate phonetic environment. So a word like winter, winter and summer, in American English, winter can become winter. But you never get winner for winter in British English, although you do get 20 for 20. And this slide is about cases where you do get this loss of T, at least in London and perhaps more generally, in these particular words. 20, plenty, want to, I want to be free, I wanted to, I want it, and went away for went away. But that's really it. Want, and its inflected forms, went, 20, plenty, end of. Here's another very new trend. It's still sort of variable, but people under 30, instead of student or student, can now say student, 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 further assimilation. You get this before TR as well, so for strong, we get strong, straight away, to strip something off. So if you like, you can do that. You can hear lots of other people doing it. I'm not going to do it though. Well, we haven't really time to talk about estuary English, but this is a term that has become very popular. It's not really a coherent variety of English, although journalists write about it as if it were. What it refers to is intermediate speech. This is an important point, though, that we must remember, that between the standard that we've codified and described to you and which we teach to you, on the one hand, and, say, Cockney, on the other hand, there's a whole spectrum of intermediate possibilities. And most people, most native speakers, are in fact located somewhere in this spectrum of possibilities, rather than at one extreme or the other. So I'm going to skip through most of these things, which I've got on my slides, just to refer you to some books about the subject if you really want to follow it up, and a web page, and come here to this slide, which is, I think, phonetically helpful. Things happening to T at the ends of syllables. The classical form is a voiceless, alveolar plosive. Not only this, but also that. Not only, but also. Voiceless, alveolar, plosive. Any of these categories can change. So instead of being alveolar, we can get glottally, giving us not only this, but also that. Not only, but also. Alternatively, we can modify the voicing. Not only this, but also that. Typical American pronunciation. Or we can modify the manner, making it a fricative. Not only this, but also that. not only, which is Irish. And that's perhaps a helpful way of looking at it. Now, on your handout, you've got stuff about American English and about Australian English. But I'm afraid I've run out of time, so I have to leave you to read that and follow it up in your own reading. Thank you very much.